All right. Welcome again, everyone, to the Gateway API meeting. It is December 11, 2023, which surprisingly enough means this is the second last meeting of the year for us. Congrats, everyone. This year has just flown by. We have canceled the meetings for the weeks of December 25th and January 1 due to so many people being out for those weeks. And as a result, that means we have one more meeting this year. That'll be December 18, at least in my time zone. And we'll go with that. But also, before I go too much further, let me take a step back and remind everyone that this is a Kubernetes community meeting. And so as such, we encourage everyone to abide by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which just means to be nice to each other. And then just another procedural thing, wherever possible, we encourage people to raise hands using the Zoom raise hand feature, just so that we can make sure anybody who wants to say anything gets a chance. We'll go with that. Okay, so maybe right off, I'll hand it off to John. And John, did you want to present this yourself, or do you want me just to scroll through?
It's probably easier for you to do it. We don't need to scroll around too much.
Cool.
Could you just go to there's like a 2.0 section. I haven't updated the doc yet, sorry.
Cool.
So I'm not sure how familiar
already. No, not yet.
No, you're not there yet. Sorry. It's a big doc.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Yep. So I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with Istio Ambient. So I'll give a brief background and why I'm talking about this at all. So in Ambient Mesh, which is the new Istio data plane, we basically trying to enable service mesh features, but without sidecars. And as part of doing that, we have this idea that we send traffic through what are essentially gateways. In past designs, we had kind of made up our own thing. We weren't using the Gateway API, the standard Gateway API that is, to configure this. But we've kind of been refactoring this design into what it is today. And I wanted to at least just bring awareness to people. It's not really a proposal to Gateway API, at least at this point. Sorry, I feel like I cut out. Can people hear me fine?
No, I can still hear you.
I can't see the screen, so hopefully you're sharing the right thing. We may eventually propose like some minor changes to make things better, but nothing at this point. The real intent of bringing this here was, one, it kind of interacts a lot with the mesh stuff. So I thought of bringing it to Gamma, but decided not to because we're actually using standard gateway object. I just wanted to bring it here and maybe get some discussion, and then we can see where to go from there, if at all. Let me pull up the doc on my page because it's a black screen right now, so it's hard to. I won't share, but
can anyone else actually see my screen share, or is it broken for everyone?
I can see it.
All right. Okay. I think it's a me problem. So the idea basically is that just ignoring Istio ignore service mesh, like if you wanted to expose a service in your cluster, like we all know how to do that. It's standard gateway. You make a gateway, you make a route, you set up some host names, right? And so the idea is what is required to go from that to kind of a service mesh use case. And for different people, there's probably different answers. In my mind, there's a few things. One is that you usually want your clients to be able to connect to the same service that they used to. So if they're doing curl foo, it still goes to foo. That maybe isn't like the best practice, but I think from a practical standpoint, it's very hard to get away from that. You at the very least need a way for clients to easily connect to all the services, right? If not curl foo, it's at least curlfoo.example.org or something along those lines. You might want some secure transport between the workload and the gateway. You want it to be efficient, not going through like some external load balancer and then back in the cluster, given all the clusters within the traffic. So there's not actually that much missing between just using the Gateway API as is totally standard and what you really need for a mesh if you're willing to use gateways in this model, right? So what we're trying to do is take that, use 100% standard Gateway APIs, and then kind of layer on some enhancements that fill out the gaps in the service mesh. So as a key part of this, like we've been trying to make it so that you can use any gateway as the gateway for this. So in this example, I use Nginx. I don't even know if there's an Nginx gateway implementation, to be honest, but it's a nice example of something that is certainly not aware of Istio or service mesh. So we're not cheating. Like in Istio, we'd probably default, of course, to using the Istio gateway class. But there's a lot of opportunity to cheat when we're using your own gateway class and do things that are non-standard and things of that nature. So at a high level, the general idea is like the gateway and the HTTP route would be exactly standard. The one thing that they would do is they would set the host names to be the cluster.local host names. And then the magic that we would add on top would be that we have another layer on this, which we call the Z-tunnel, or the secure transport layer. In theory, it could be implemented by any CNI or kubectl type thing. And it can do some extra enhancements to redirect traffic from the normal service cluster IP to the gateway, and then to add the secure transport, which in our case is typically MTLS. So that's mostly it at a high level. I can discuss a lot more about this, but I'm trying to elide a lot of info that's probably not useful to the people here. We can say that's cool and move on, or discuss more. Either one's fine, really. I just wanted to at least present it to people here so they're aware of what's going on. Importantly, if you're a gateway implementation and we do this, you, in theory, might become a mesh implementation as well for some definition of mesh. So either you're welcome or sorry. I will say, actually, that this does remind me of like, what does this mean for Gamma? In my mind, this shouldn't change Gamma. We had talked a lot about this in previous meetings in Gamma, that Gamma is about meeting people where they are. Like we have service meshes binding to service and adding policies to them. We might not want to use service in the long term, but even if we add something new, we're still going to want to attach a service. So we can have these multiple solutions. One thing we do still need to figure out is what happens if you do this and Gamma at the same exact time in the same cluster. We'll need to work out some of the semantics there and stuff. This proposal is extremely early, actually. Wrote it up on Friday, so it's very fresh. There's a lot of rough edges, but kind of been trying to move fast. Go ahead, Candace.
Ooh. Hey, John. I don't know if someone else spoke at the same time, but I heard a strange noise. But I wanted to, we do have a use case like this for switching in and out of service mesh to north-south gateway. So I think, you know, I can give you another use case for why you might want to do something like this. But what is it about it that's ambient? I mean, does this example that you're talking about now, how is this ambient mesh?
Yeah, so the experience from the real, ignoring APIs and details, the mission of ambient in my mind is to say at the base layer, you get 100% compatibility for free, whatever features we can give you in that bucket. Today, we basically consider that MTLS, which is the same as a lot of other CNIs give you in WireGuard and IPsec or whatever. Then as a service owner, you may want to say, I actually need L7 functionality for my application. I want request level load balancing or rate limiting or something, right? And so we give them the ability to, on a per service base, to opt into these more functionality. And we do that by sending traffic effectively through a load balancer or gateway running in another pod that's decoupled from their application. So in the past, we had done that through a bit more magic, non-standard things like the initial ambient proposal. You basically have like you basically say namespace is L7, more or less. Like the details will just confuse people, I think. And then you use Gamma routes. So it's a bit more implicit. This just makes it using 100% standard APIs so that you can not only use the Istio specific waypoint is what we call it, that implemented that, but you can use literally any gateway as long as it's spec compliant.
Nick, I think you're up next. Oh, sorry. Let's see. That impressive.
Okay, none of you needed to hear that, but so for this, I guess, stepping back a little bit and looking at this purely from a sort of what is a gateway perspective, it makes sense to me to some extent in that a gateway has always, in my mind, been about enriching sort of a flow with with context. On one side of the gateway there's less context, and on the other side of the gateway there's more context. And so in this case, the context is sort of like between the consumer of a service and the producer of the service, right? Like, to use the language we talked about in Gamma. So the producer of the service sort of is doing some extra stuff on the gateway to say, hey, I want to do some extra, I want this stuff to happen service to service as well as north south. And I really like that part about it. It does feel like I think that the goal of using 100% vanilla gateway API constructs is awesome. It does feel like we're kind of making it a little bit harder to explain exactly what a gateway is, because like we're kind of having lots of gateways that are inside the cluster. That's probably not too big a deal, to be honest. I think that the important part again comes back to like differences in amount of context between on either side of the gateway. So yeah, I think in general it seems good from what I've seen, from what I've read. I did have a little bit of a look at this beforehand. Yeah, I think that it would be good to it'd be good for us all to spend some time reading this and thinking about it. It is a good time to bring up this sort of stuff, John, I think, because now we've got Christmas to have it background process. I know that's how my brain works. A lot of the time this stuff background processes, and then I come back and be like, oh, what about? So yeah, I guess. So yeah, for me, I guess to use a Simpsonsism, I feel cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, and I think I'd echo a lot of your thoughts there, Nick. This was I also got to take a bit of a look beforehand on this as well. One of my questions, I guess I have a few kind of small nitpicky questions, I guess, here, but one of them would be, let's say that you have multiple addresses exposed by the gateway. I'm assuming this comes all the way full circle back to Dave's gap of routability, where you're probably trying to find the cluster IP and not just, if you've got an LB IP or whatever, you're trying not to redirect, or I don't know, it could do this with DNS too. However you're doing that redirection, I imagine you'd want that to be to the cluster local IP. Is that correct?
Dave's gap would be, I kind of actually forgot that was removed. That would be very, very helpful for this, because users are probably going to configure it to be not external. Actually, there could be use cases where they want it external and they like have one thing serving two purposes.
I think my own audio cut out. Sorry.
I can hear you.
Speaking and everyone else can hear you, and I can't.
Okay, I can hear John just fine, but you are frozen on my screen, Rob.
Yeah, Rob's frozen for me.
Sorry, I can.
There you go. You're back, Rob.
Thank you. I did catch. I'm sorry, I missed that.
Let me repeat. So yeah, Dave's gap would have been really handy, because most users will probably want, I forget what we called it, but cluster local IP, cluster IP, whatever we called it in the API, but a cluster IP. I could imagine someone maybe wants an external IP as well, if they want to like kill two birds with one stone and make like the same thing for in cluster and out of cluster. Don't know if that's the best idea. We'll probably have to sketch that out a bit more. But certainly for the default case, I would imagine you want the internal IP. And that's a big issue, I think. So I may be very motivated to progress that gap again, if possible.
Yeah. I think that makes sense. And then, obviously in gateway land, we consider it very common, or at least we want it to be common, for the same route to attach to multiple gateways. I think in your proposal, a gateway has to be labeled in some way as a waypoint for it to detect, but like,
so I think there's two parts to it. One part is on the gateway, we need some way to tell the network this is a waypoint, so redirect to it. That part is not going to change how the gateway implementation behaves in any way. It's more of a signal to the network. How we expose that is TBD. basically all the syntax here is TBD, by the way. The high level concepts, I think we're pretty set on, but we haven't actually iterated that much on the syntax. So there's a lot of weird things. The other thing is like how we identify a specific service should bind to that gateway. And I think in the current one, we do it based on listener name, which everyone, like this name foo is like matched to service foo. Everyone agrees this is terrible. We're not going to do that. But we haven't decided what we will do instead.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should be
No,
clear.
that's
I also have a vested interest here in that whatever Istio Ambient does, like I need to do too. So yeah, so I think that in that respect, yeah, like I think having a way to indicate something like this gateway needs some fancy networking shenanigans would be a good thing. But exactly how we do that, I think it's good to leave that as TBD for now and think more about the use cases before we start getting into actual design mode.
Yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is exciting. Thank you for raising this. I'm always interested to see another use of Gateway that, you know, is not really how I initially imagined it being used, but it seems, you know, like promising is what I would say. So, cool.
Yeah. One quick thing. So we talked about service. There's also possible use cases where you want to send all traffic through a gateway, even if it's not bound to a service. Maybe you're using headless services, you don't use a service. That's not really something you can expose in the Gateway API today. We may be proposing things along those lines in the future. I have absolutely no idea what that will look like, but just an FYI that we're potentially interested in that space and maybe bringing proposals and whatnot.
Cool. Good to know.
Yeah, go ahead, Philip.
Yeah. Philip, did you have anything? Hey, maybe I can't hear. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to make sure I was next. I think this might be very similar to what we've been talking about. And in fact, like directing all the traffic, whether it's in a service or not, is a little bit like the sort of L3, L4 discussion we've been having. I'm in a little bit of a post-lunch crash, but I'm going to re-listen to this video at this particular meeting. I think there's a lot that we could work on together.
Yeah, that's a really
very
good
much
point.
doing, in our implementation, we're very much doing, particularly in the service provider use case, there's a lot of kind of blurring lines between east-west and north-south, where everything goes through a gateway between namespaces. So yeah, again, I think this could be very, very interesting discussion.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for bringing that up. I would love to see if there's overlap with other, earlier discussions as well. Anytime we can solve more than one thing with one gap or series of gaps, that's a great win. Not that this would be a gap, but yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
There may be some relevance in what I'm going to talk about next.
Yeah, speaking of gaps, I hear there's a gap about gaps. Maybe Nick, you want to talk about it?
Yeah, if you could pop that open. Yeah, so I heard you all like gaps, so I made a gap about gaps. As you can see here, like, yeah, some gaps, one of the things that's become clear is some gaps are not the same as other gaps. Some gaps are about agreeing on common ground, or as in the case of this one, changing the process of gaps. Historically, we haven't done a gap to change the gap process. So this actually came out of me starting work on an item to split up the policy attachment gap, because it's currently it's about 16,000 words, nearly 17,000 words at the moment, that gap. So I don't feel that it's fair that we require people to read the equivalent of an honors thesis in order to be able to work with a pattern. I think all the maintainers are in agreement that one is just too big. So we need to split it up. But in splitting it up, one of the things that I sort of came up with was that we need like a summary gap to introduce the idea of policy attachment and some sort of rough outline of what we are going to work on. And then we have more specific gaps that talk about, say, direct policy attachment or indirect policy attachment or inherited policy attachment, sorry. And when I said that, I thought, we actually have a couple of gaps that are similar to that. Notably, the main mesh gap that sort of says, hey, we want to do something with mesh, is sort of like that, in that it's a gap that sort of says, hey, here's a problem, we're laying out a problem, we're talking about it in a certain way, maybe we've got some use cases, and then this gap is now the basis. The fact that we agree on this gap is now the basis for other gaps. And so one of the things that I want to do as part of this, of the gap, is to add a new type of gap that I'm currently calling memorandum. So short for memorandum of understanding, but just like, this is a purely sort of informational gap. The idea here is to have the this memorandum gap be a very abbreviated process. Basically, there's everyone agrees or they don't. There's no sort of multiple stages here. Either we as a community accept a memorandum or we don't. And so then this one would be sort of the first example of this, and then we'll backport that to probably the mesh gap, and then as I split out the policy attachment gap, that will the basic gap 713 will become a memorandum gap that then has specific changes split out of it. The rubric that I'm using here is that if a gap doesn't and will never have any actual API changes or anything added to the API, then probably it should be a memorandum rather than a full gap. And thanks, Candace. We do already have a gap about transitions and states. Yes, that's true. So the intent here is to sort of add some extra transitions and states, and essentially an extra channel, like an extra line in the flowchart. Right now, the flowchart is sort of, you start out with a discussion, you make an issue, then everything moves through provisional, experimental, standard, basically. That doesn't make sense as much for memorandums. So I think there'll be a separate one there. The other thing as part of this that I realized is that we are at a stage where we need relationships between gaps. We need to be able to formally define relationships between gaps. Luckily, there's plenty of prior art here. I spent a whole bunch of time looking at the IETF RFCs. They have a couple of relationships. KEPs also have a couple of relationships. Mainly, the things that you generally need are obsoletes and obsoleted by, and updates or is related to. And then the intent here is to once we've sort of agreed that this is a thing that we want to do, i.e. we've merged this one, that I'll also, or that maybe even as part of this one, that I'll update the current gap docs to sort of to make allowances for the fact that there are two. So that page that Candace just posted, which is the gap overview, will be updated to sort of have whatever we agree on in here. Lastly, the thing that I think was worth also making clear, I spent a bunch of time finding important RFCs and reading RFCs, which sidebar is very interesting. If you go back and read the extremely low numbered RFCs, as people who are working on Gateway API, you'll probably find a lot of the stuff that's in those RFCs sort of, it's not the same, but it rhymes, with a lot of the discussions we've been having. I think that we really need to sort of try and make use of the fact that people have done similar things before with the internet itself, and learn as much as we can from them. So I've tried to crib a lot here. The last thing that I want to add in here is we have an explicit note that we use in one of the pages that we use RFC 2119, which is using must, may, must, should, may, and associated words. There is actually an extension to that, RFC 8174, which says basically those words are only that specific when you write them in all caps. If you just write must in lowercase, it's not the same as if you write must in uppercase. I think we've generally tended to do that, but we haven't been really specific about it. And so what I'm proposing here is that we do become more specific about it, and only in our spec when we say must and we mean must, we put it in capital letters so that it's very clear what we mean when we say that. If we're just using the English word must, which is slightly different to the RFC word, then we use the English word, but we don't. But and I think that comes in more with should and may than it does with must. You might say this should work like that, but that's not the same as this should happen. And so I think that's important. So that's what I am partway through working on this gap. It shouldn't actually be that long. I'm trying to be pretty specific about the things that we're adding. I think probably the last relevant thing I wanted to call out is the current GEP process. I'm going to call, so the new type of GEPs will be memorandum. The current GEP process, I want to call an API GEP because that's what it is. It's a GEP that affects the API, the spec of the API. Obviously, I'm happy to talk about naming. Naming is hard, but I figured it was better to have some names and tell me that they're bad than to try and argue about names as from first principles. So yes, I expect that this PR will be done today or tomorrow. So it should be available for people to look at before we go away. Before everything starts winding up. If we could get this merged before Christmas, I would very much appreciate it, because then it will make it mean that over the sort of the quiet period, just before Christmas and New Year, and after the New Year, I can be working away on splitting up GEP 713 using this as the framework. So with that, I'm finished talking.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for taking this on. This is a big piece of work. I think Candace, maybe her comments may have been similar to my original comments here too. Like if we could extend what we already have instead of having a new GEP, but I'm also fine. I think you're in this more than I am, or deeper than I am at this point. So, I'm open with a new GEP as well. You're adding a new class of GEP is what it sounds like, and so I guess
yeah. And so I think the other reason I wanted to use a GEP here is that I think we need to get in the habit of doing this for process changes as well, because then now that once this is done, we will have relationships. Then it will be easier to say we've replaced this process because this GEP obsoletes the old GEP. And so it means that we can keep history more easily. And that's sort of where I think one of the big advantages of the RFC archive is. Sorry, Candace.
Just a quick note. I feel like it would be a shame if we had to, if we got a good process out of this, but we had to go back and update all of the existing GEPs with it. Just my opinion on that. I don't know who else.
I think
would agree with that.
I 100% agree. 100% agree. The intent here is to make it so that I'll go back and update the GEPs that I consider memorandums. But everything else, I think the way I have worded it so far is that if a GEP doesn't mention what type it is, it's an API GEP. And so it's, and then as we go forward, we add the new type, and from now on, we talk about GEP types. We talk about we add relationships as needed. And then basically for existing ones, where you obsolete an old GEP, you go back and you add the relationship section, and you add obsoleted by new GEP name, or updated by new GEP name, or something like that. Like you only update it when you touch it, but you are free to update things if you need to. And so I think that feels like the best way to sort of make a pretty fundamental change like this, but where we're not spending a whole bunch of time like going back and updating templates on old documents that don't really add much value. Thank you, Candace. I 100% agree that is a risk that we need to manage as part of this.
Cool. Yeah, and the other thing I would say is if we are getting into a place where we're creating more GEPs, which this seems to be leading towards, we're definitely going to need to make a corresponding investment in making GEPs easier to manage, because right now we're already bursting at the seams with our current GEP management approaches. So, even just the doc site, it's hard to find a GEP that you might be looking for. So I think you'd already mentioned you have some work in progress there too. But yeah, just everything has cascading effects, it seems. Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you.
As part of my work on sort of figuring out like what I wanted to do about GEPs, I have like somewhere between 15 and 20 to do items for updating the doc site itself too. So that's later. I want to do this bit first. The docs updates are easy compared to writing the GEP updates. So I'll do the GEP updates first.
Cool. All right. I think the next couple are mine. So let me actually go a little out of order because I think this one may be a bit faster. Gaurav actually was the one to find this, but one of the things in our cell validation is that we require that certificate refs are specified when TLS mode is set to terminate, which, you know, conceptually makes sense. Like, yeah, you need a TLS certificate somewhere if you have TLS mode type terminate. But what has become increasingly clear is that not every TLS certificate needs to be defined within a cluster, right? You may have, for example, cloud providers may refer to certificates that exist in their cloud, for example, or in some kind of managed product. I imagine that's not unique to GKE or won't be unique to GKE forever. So I think this is validation that we may have made too strict too soon. And I am proposing that we walk it back and just remove this restriction. But wanted to open it up because this is something that is a change in validation. And anytime we're considering changing validation, I want to make it very, very visible. Anyone have any concerns or similar use cases here? Mike?
Yeah, so I'll actually be speaking on behalf of my prior project, not my current one, but in Console API Gateway, this was interesting because we cared about using Vault as a CA. So Vault, to do this, we would basically need a way to reference the certificate refs for TLS mode terminate in a Kubernetes compatible way, like pointing to a resource within the cluster. We did not have that at the time, but this actually was good in that it motivated and basically gave us a framework by which to make that work happen. So there is now a way to reference vault secrets in a Kubernetes native way through an actual CRD that would not have happened if this was not required.
Yeah, that's actually a really good context. I had thought of Vault in particular as you know, a very common you know, certificate provider. I imagine there are others too, but yeah, that is a good use case. So in that case, you were using an object ref to refer to a CRD, and the CRD pointed outside of the cluster, roughly.
Yeah, this is basically a placeholder that Vault operator or Console API Gateway knows how to do something with.
Yep, got it. Cool. Nick?
Yeah, I think that is the reason why the certificate reference is a like a general object reference and not only a secret, is so that you can expand that sort of thing by doing exactly that, having an indirection CID somewhere. I would probably be more in favor of encouraging people who don't want a secret to have something in the cluster that represents the particular certificate. So because because if you're not doing that, then you're probably going to be doing some sort of implicit referencing thing, where some other thing references the gateway by name, probably, or even the listener by name. And as we have found with a policy attachment, that sort of like back reference is way harder to understand a reason about than having a forward reference from the object. And so like my feeling here is that it's probably a better architectural pattern to encourage people to, for places where you have an externally stored cert that's not an actual secret or something, that you have a CRD or something that sits in the cluster, that having that represents that particular certificate or that set of certificates in some external system.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. To clarify, the one use case I'm familiar with being GKE here, we actually use TLS options and have basically a reference to a resource ID, which is like it's a little contrived. We considered adding like for example, you could have that kind of intermediate CRD that then refer, or maybe like not even a CRD, but make up your own kind and group and everything to refer to something like outside of Kubernetes. But that felt really weird too, because if you follow the reference, it follows it to nowhere. And then having the intermediate didn't seem quite right either. I don't know, but I agree. The forward reference is very helpful and important here. Keith?
Yeah, so on Azure, we're in a bit of a similar situation where folks will want to refer to things in Azure Key Vault and refer to secrets in Azure Key Vault specifically. And we've got a way to make it work with certificate references by using secret store CSI drivers for Azure and those sorts of things. I forget what the exact AKV thing is, but for Azure, you've got one for secret store that is essentially kind of what Nick was describing, a thing that talks to the Azure resource and creates that actually creates a curated secret you can reference. But I definitely see the use case. It creates a bit of churn because, especially because the secret store CSI driver requires you to have a pod that's running to map the secret into. It's bound to the pod runtime itself, which is kind of inconvenient when you need to reference it by the gateway. So I don't know. It would be nice to have a easier way, but I'm also compelled by the points that were previously made, where having that reference in the cluster has a lot of benefits and is probably a better pattern as a whole if you just take the universalism principle where everybody used, if there were less CRDs and everybody was using like referring to things outside the cluster, it's probably not great. Maybe there's room, I'm just spitballing at this point, maybe there's room for like a pattern for a config map for a cloud resource or something like that, or some generic thing. Maybe even within a particular cloud, but I don't know, I'm just kind of spitballing thoughts at this point. But I definitely see the use case for sure.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm sorry. I think I lost just a little middle bit of what you said, but hopefully I got the most of it. What I definitely, it's good to hear what Azure is doing here as well. And I think that this idea of referring to certificates or loading certificates from somewhere outside of the cluster is going to be fairly widespread. I'd also agree that the most intuitive way is when you can have a reference to a resource that exists in the cluster. When you have a reference to a resource that exists outside of the cluster, there's a variety of ways you could do it, and it seems like we're exploring a few of them with different implementations, but they all feel a little weird to me. My concern is that I think from an API perspective, I want to be very clear that we do not require that certificates live inside the cluster, right? Because that's not.
Yeah, so I want to be clear. I don't think that this does not require that certificates live inside the cluster. This requires that there is an object in the cluster that points to a certificate. It's a subtle point, but like it is important. And I think that the sort of the huge gain that we get in visibility and like explicit configuration is way worth not making this optional for now. I think that we need to figure out like, because if we make this optional, then like the problem is it's very easy to then if we make this optional, we are no longer, in a very common case, i.e. you're using a secret, we're no longer requiring that secret be referenced correctly. in the as part of at the apply level of validation, right, at the cell level. And so that means that now we're going to now people will be much more required to go and check the status to find out whether or not the secret that they created or that they've referenced is like you've forgotten to put a secret on. More importantly, you will create the thing, it'll seem like everything's fine, but you've got to go and look at the status to find out that you missed your secret and in fact I think we kind of like that you've missed your secret or that you've missed something, right? Like I think that it's right now that the loss to UX is not worth the trade-off whereas I think that I personally feel like that it would be way better for us to say, if you're storing secrets as external to the cluster, that's fine. You need to have something in the cluster that references the fact that you have a secret outside the cluster, because that makes the cluster config complete on its own. Like like in that, the fact that there is a secret outside the cluster is represented inside the cluster, in some fashion, explicitly. And I think that's really, really, really important. I think we should talk more about this probably on the issue, but like I think I actually feel pretty strongly about this. So I really don't want us to just move ahead with this and without talking about the implications.
Sorry, that is good to hear. I agree. We should follow up async on the issue itself. I feel strongly in that other direction. My concern is adding an additional config that it's one more piece that can break. Really, that's for implementations that are stuck this way, it's one more reference that can go wrong. But I think this is a bigger can of worms than I anticipated. So we'll take it offline and follow up on the issue. Yeah. Cool. Speaking of big cans of worms, let me just mention, I'm not trying to go deep into this one, but let me at least mention that there are 3 active conversations going on right now that all seem highly, highly related to each other. So I forget which order we have this in, but there's this one that covers the idea of listener and gateway level extensions, which I think we've discussed in previous meetings at a high level. And I think John's comment is one of the big open questions, concerns right now of, do we really want to expand extension refs, or should we be going the other direction and building policy attachment for all the things instead of having multiple ways? So this is one piece of the conversation. Then we have another piece of the conversation in 2300, which is why only attach to one object? This is a recurring question that comes with policy attachment. This is not the first time it's come up. I believe there's an issue similar to this, but this got bumped recently by Sanjay again, and the idea is that for policies to be useful or usable, it would be really, really helpful to be able to reuse them instead of the current state where you can attach to a single resource at a time. And I definitely get that frustration. Obviously, with policy, we are trying to walk a very, very delicate balance between usefulness and UX versus just adding, one too many features and going completely bankrupt on our complexity budget, which some may say we have already done, but we are awfully close to that complexity budget. And then finally, the last one that I want to bring up that has had some more recent discussion was Shane's discussion here about gateway plugins, which plugins, as some in here have already mentioned, are awfully similar to extensions and policies. One thing that potentially sets them apart is that plugins often, at least in this definition, seem to have a phase associated with them. So you're defining at what point in the request lifecycle you want to inject this behavior. This is a huge topic, but it feels awfully closely related to the other topics that are in flight. I don't think, well, I know we don't have time to discuss any of them in detail in today's call, but I would, I guess, encourage the ongoing discussion that's happening in these GitHub discussions. And maybe before you comment on any individual one, if you can kind of look a little bit more broadly at the broader state of the world here, because there are a few things that are pulling us in different directions here, is what I would say. Yeah, did anyone want to add like a high level comment on this, not without diving too deep?
I am extremely worried about the complexity budget. Extremely worried about it. That's why I keep pushing back on, consider the UX. I think, for all he and I butt heads, like Flynn had a really good point that, policy attachments, backwards references are by default bad UX, that we need to consider a risk and we need to manage. Leaning more heavily on policy attachment only makes that problem worse. The advantage of extension ref is that it's forward reference, and so the complexity is lower. But that we need to really be really careful about how much complexity we're adding. And again, that goes for things like, having one policy attached to multiple objects. It's just another step of complexity. In the same way that we have, and we run the risk of having multiplicative complexity problems. When we add complexity over here and we add complexity over here, and you can use the two things together, now we've added like an exponential level of complexity. And that, that goes for lots of things. Like people keep coming to us and saying, why can you only have 8 route matches or 8 rules in a route? And we say, well, because you can have so many backends and so many things. And so it means that right now you can have like over 1,000 combinations inside one HTTP route. That's why we don't let you have more rules, because then you can use those rules in combinations with the backends. This is what we're worried about with multiplicative complexity. And so that's why we need to be very conscious of our complexity budget. Obviously, that is the job of those of us who wear the maintainer hat to worry about that sort of thing. It is completely fine for people to say, I want this. But like, if we're saying no, it's not because we hate you and we don't like your stuff. It's because like a lot of the time we're really worried about the fact that we're all going to end up screwed if we don't really carefully manage the complexity budget. Sorry to talk for a long time, Keith. Over to you.
Yeah, no problem. I think the one of these that's really interesting to me, that feels a bit unique, would be Shane's discussion, because Shane's discussion is not about reconciling the two extension mechanisms we already have, though I completely agree with you, Nick, that that's something that we need to do and manage. But Shane's discussion is more of something along the lines of wow, Keith, words. It's getting late on my time. But Shane's discussion is surrounding something that's not possible in Gateway API today at all, which is data plane, like user-defined data plane extensions. That's something that I've got definitely have a lot of interest in, and recognize that would be taking a loan from that complexity budget. We'd be determining at some point whether we felt like that loan gets paid back in actual usefulness for users. But I do think that that's something that we should, I'm going to be looking forward to catching up on the thread, seeing what new changes have been made since I last took a look. Because I think that's one of the actual pieces of functionality missing in the spec today. And as much as it is possible to try to find some consistent phasing or data plane extension across multiple data plane implementations, and expressing that in a single API, I think we should certainly try to do so, especially now that we're past 1.0.
Yeah, well said. Let me time back box. Let's give another 2 to 3 minutes total on this. Shane, you're next.
I was just going to say, we don't have time to go over it in detail, but plugins could mean just about anything. However, I think where we're kind of slowly heading, and we are taking this one very slow. This has been open for several months, and I don't expect us to be starting an implementation anytime soon. But where we're kind of heading towards is the the join between implementations being able to do two things: load custom code and then put it in specific, Keith said phases, I'll go with phases. We're kind of heading towards that. If that is something that your implementation does and you're interested in making that portable for the end users, something that they can go between implementations and that works as close as it can, then please do comment on this. We need more allies, more people that are like actively interested in those two bits. There could be more to plugins than just that, but I think that's kind of the crux of where we're at in the conversation right now.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for starting that conversation. Give Nick 30 seconds or so to finish up.
Yeah. Every time I read this thing, I am internally screaming about the complexity. I am so scared about the complexity budget here. Yeah, like I just it absolutely terrifies me. The idea that we will end up with a way to define for every single request like multiple phases that then have to be supported across multiple data planes that then you can inject arbitrary code at, which means that then we have to handle like, how do you specify the arbitrary code? How do you, how do we ensure that the phases are consistent across the implementations, and how do we make sure all of this stuff is portable? That like absolutely terrifies me. And so like, it's great that we're moving slowly on this one. Like I really encourage people who are thinking more about this to think about multiplicative complexity problems and how are you going to conformance test this? Like those are the things that are like that immediately jump to my mind, that are like, you don't have to design the whole thing, but you need to be like, how are you going to ensure portability for these things, if at all? So yeah, those are sort of the first two things that I thought of.
Makes sense. All right, thank you, everyone. I was muted, sorry. Thank you, everyone, for a good discussion on that. Let me leave it there because we have a couple items in triage. But yes, a reminder, all those discussions exist, and I'm no doubt will continue. And please think of them holistically because each affects the other in at least some way. This one is just a FYI. There's no possible way that we can cover this in today's couple minutes we have left, but I just wanted people to be aware that this is a huge test. It comes back to something that we spent a lot of time talking about, listener isolation. Thank you for actually coming through to write the test out. I took a high level look, and it seems, again, high level, it seems roughly like what I would expect here, but this is going to need a lot of careful review and multiple implementations to sign off on it because it really does have a significant impact. Again, a reminder, this is starting as a extended feature, a supported feature. It's not something that we require everyone to do from day one, but it is a mode that we're encouraging everyone to support. So yeah, just heads up, we're looking for as many reviews as possible on this. Yeah. And then the very last one was 2652. This is another change to validation for TLS. So yay, validation changes. This one I think is a bit less controversial, I hope. But this person recognized that we were missing a form of validation that seemed like it could be helpful. Basically, if you have set the protocol to HTTPS, you should not combine that with pass-through. That's something that we've said clearly in our docs and spec for some time. We have not added that in terms of cell validation or webhook any kind of validation until now. I think this is a reasonable change, but we need to be very careful with it because it is by definition backwards incompatible. And we need to think through, like technically our versioning guidelines allow for this kind of change to go through, but we really haven't tested that limit very much, and certainly not in terms of cell, which will have a very immediate and widespread impact, where webhook, you could just not install a webhook kind of thing. So yeah, just awareness that this is another one that could use some more eyes. Yeah, that's all I have in triage. So we actually have an extra minute left if anyone has any last items. Otherwise, we can all have a minute of our time back. Cool. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been great. We'll see many of you next week, and then that'll be the last one for the year. Have a great one.
Bye, all.